Hello, everybody. Kathy, thank you. That was really, really good. Vast subject, and you delivered it beautifully. Thank you. And Christopher, thank you also, because I really didn't know what the title of my presentation was going to be. I had to change it. Hildred asked me to speak about 10 years after. I probably won't have time to speak about 10 years after, so if I come next year, it's going to be 11 years after, and you'll be in suspense for 1 year. The title, Christopher, and thanks a lot, is How Did We Get Here? I like that very much. Now, I'm going to ask you all a question here. Who thinks that it's right that Pavel Durov was arrested a couple of days ago at the airport in Le Bourget? Let's have a show of hands. Who thinks it's right? Pavel Durov, the CEO of Telegram. You probably read about it, which is why I changed my presentation, because I wanted to be very topical. He was arrested. He came in his private jet, if you don't have the facts. He landed at Le Bourget. He knew there was a warrant against him for his arrest. And he was arrested, and right now he's in prison. Again, CEO of Telegram. Who thinks that it's right that he was arrested? Okay. Who thinks it's wrong? Interesting. A lot of abstentions. So what I'm going to do is try and explain the legal background for his arrest. Put it into context. You all know what Telegram is, right? Telegram is this. Actually, what I learned by researching this, what I did yesterday evening, is that it's the second biggest social media website in the world. It's 3 times as big as X, as the former Twitter. 1 billion users. 1 billion users. Now, the reason that we don't really know that too much here is that it's mainly users in Russia. It's mainly users in countries that have no freedom of speech. Because what he really stands for, this Durov, who was arrested, is never, 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 ever work together with law enforcement in sharing the identity of the people that put stuff out on Telegram. Never, ever. Don't cooperate with law enforcement. That is why he was arrested. So I'm going to show you, I only have 3 charts. See how this one works. Okay. You see, I had to add this last one yesterday, right? I didn't know what happened yesterday. There's only one bit of news that's more important. That is, did you hear? Oasis are getting together. Did you hear that? Had I known that yesterday, I would have included it. Okay. So can anybody tell me what has DiCaprio to do with this? Don't cheat. Don't look at your phones. Please. Okay. What? Well, yeah, that's good. That's good. That's good. I talked about, maybe I should go like 10 years after. What I want to do is make you all, giving you some legal background into what happened day before yesterday at Le Bourget Airport, right? Now, in order to do that, I need to go back further than 10 years. I need to go back 30 years. 30 years. 30 years ago, John Perry Barlow, who was the lyricist of a rock band called Grateful Dead, you probably never heard of them, came out with what he called the Second Declaration of Independence. Second Declaration of Independence was the independence of humanity in cyberspace, right? He saw that 30 years ago. And he said, you are not welcome here. Who is you? Who do you think you is? You are not welcome here. What did he mean? The government. You are not welcome here. This is our free space. So that was the Second Declaration of Independence. Now, very, very quickly, the legal framework really didn't adapt to this Declaration of Independence. And next year is going to be precisely 30 years ago. That one of the leading cases that developed the legal situation that we have today, both in the US and most of Europe, was a case involving the background for this movie, Stratum Oakham. Now, you probably know that this is more or less factual. It had to do with a company on Wall Street defrauding investors. The CEO and the CFO went to prison, and the company went bankrupt. All right, that's really what the movie is about. It's a true story. What happened was that the CEO of Stratum Oakholm sued a company called Prodigy. Now, this was a bulletin board. Remember, 30 years ago, right? We didn't have social media. What we had was bulletin boards, right? So somebody would create an internet site and you could post whatever you wanted on it. And there was this investor who felt that he was defrauded and put up on this bulletin board called Prodigy that this was a sham company. And he attacked the CEO personally. And what did the CEO do? He attacked Prodigy, the bulletin board, for defamation. Right? Now, under common law, and we find that in many civil law countries also, but it's not exactly the same, the publisher of defamatory content is complicit in disseminating the defamatory content, right? So this was the legal basis, really to simplify the common law basis. The bulletin board was the publisher, right? Now, what do you think happened? Was Prodigy condemned for participating or being an accomplice in defamation, or were they not? What do you think happened? Well, they were condemned. They had to pay damages, and they almost went bankrupt. Now, just before that, 1 year before that, we're back in 94, 91, out of 95, something like that. There was another case. It was called the Kubi versus CompuServe case. More or less the same facts. And CompuServe, which was the bulletin board then, they were acquitted. So how come? Well, the reason was that the judges decided that in this particular case, the Stratum Oakholm case, the bulletin board Prodigy was accountable for content because they had a moderating activity, right? They were actually looking at the content that was third-party generated, and I wouldn't use the word censored it, but they moderated it. That's a good thing to do, isn't it? Well, stay away from good things to do. That caused them to go bankrupt. The other one, CompuServe, they just let people post whatever they wanted. And that was okay. So of course, that started a major debate based on this John Perry Barlow second Declaration of Independence saying, come on guys, I mean, we have this wonderful cyberspace and we should be able to express our opinions, and we should also be able to express our opinions moderating them a bit if we feel that they're dangerous. But if we do that, we go to prison, more or less. So then two representatives came up with a draft bill, which has later become the Communications Decency Act, which is still in force and effect, 230C. It entered into effect in 1996. And it basically says that bulletin boards or hosts are not publishers. Full stop. Right? So the liability or the accountability basis, as I mentioned before, was based on being the publisher. They are not by definition publishers. And then it has what is called a Samaritan clause in section 2, which says that also applies even if the bulletin board or the host moderates, right? So you no longer go to prison if you do the right thing. Perfect. And that is what happened, and that's what is, that movie is not about that case, right? But that case is very, 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 very important in the development of this lack of accountability on the internet. Fast forward to this one, which was taken this morning, a couple of months ago, called Elon Musk, and you know who the other guy is? Thierry Breton, the commissioner, the French commissioner. He's the one in charge of IT, and he is certainly the one in charge of the Digital Services Act. You probably all heard about that one, right? It entered into effect recently. For big platforms, it actually entered into effect last year. So this is the counter-reaction to the cyberspace freedom that I just described, which the Communications Decency Act, Section 230C, remember that one, created. The counter-reaction is the European reaction. The European reaction, I'm not speaking about the rest of the world, I'm just speaking about Europe and the US, right? We don't have time to talk about China and Russia and all of that. So the European reaction, very much inspired by French law, goes for middle of the road in terms of two human rights, right? One is freedom of expression, right? And how would you say, what is the other one? Freedom to live your life. The presumption of innocence. There are many other counterweight human rights that really are at the same level in Europe. If you look at the Declaration of Human Rights that came out after the French Revolution, 1789, it has this equal level of freedom of speech and other human rights. I'm not saying that they don't have that in the US. And actually, the reason the First Amendment is the First Amendment is not because it was deemed to be more important than the others, because originally, when the fathers of the Constitution drafted it, it was the Third Amendment. So it's not kind of like it's the first, it's more important. No. But in the US, there is a tradition of free speech. I'm not going to discuss whether I think it's right or wrong, but it's more or less absolute. And that absolutism, of course, on the basis of what I just described, has now been transformed into this wild west of what's happening on the internet. Now, in Europe, again, we've had this discussion. As I mentioned before, it's not just the French Revolution, but the French also started a very, very important law, which was a post-World War II law, which was the law Guizot, which was one of the first laws in Europe, I think was the first, that criminalized negationism, right? Negationism is to say that the Holocaust didn't exist, right? And this was actually tested before the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, because there was a professor at the Sorbonne who challenged that, saying that it's a violation of human rights. It was found that it did not violate the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which is, as you probably heard, Article 19 comes from that covenant, right? That is the free speech. I just want to make sure. The European Convention of Human Rights, freedom of expression is Article 10. So when you hear Article 19, it's not the European Convention, it's the UN Convention. So anyway, inspired by this French approach, very much so, but yeah, I should say really very much so, the European Union started working on some sort of accountability for websites, and especially now social media that didn't exist back then, for content. Again, if you look at Facebook, they claim to have something like 2 billion pieces of content, or I don't know, on a daily basis or weekly basis. It makes no difference when you have these enormous numbers. Of course, they cannot be accountable for what third parties put up, even though a lot of it creates hate speech, diversity, and destroys people's and groups' lives. So the European Union had what was called the e-commerce directive, which says that contrary to the Communications Decency Act, remember 1996, we in Europe will say that if a host, and a host includes social media, acquires actual knowledge, right? That's the notion, actual knowledge, which it can do by a notice. You know, you write to them that this and that is on your website, please take it down. Then if the host does not take it down, then they are accountable for what happens. That was replaced by the Digital Services Act, which is the one I mentioned before, which for big platforms entered into effect last year, and for everybody, more or less everybody, applies now, under Thierry Breton. The Digital Services Act includes, and this is really interesting, because everybody knows about the GDPR, right? Privacy. The maximum fine under the GDPR is 4% of global turnover. Global turnover, not bottom line. What do you think the maximum fine for a violation of the Digital Services Act is? Any ideas? 6%. All right? 2 percentage points more than a violation of privacy. Actually, very interesting, right? That the European Union found that it was more important to preserve life and happiness and the presumption of innocence and so on and so forth than privacy. Very interesting. So anyway, that's so far we haven't really seen an application of the 6%, and it also went into effect very recently, but that is the situation. And actually, I should say now, you probably saw the press release this morning from the European Commission, most probably drafted by Thierry Breton, saying that we, the Commission, have nothing to do with the arrest made by the French police of the CEO of Telegram. It is not because of the Digital Services Act that he was arrested. Did you see? They quickly went out and said that. They didn't want the bad press, right? And it is true that the Digital Services Act does not include prison sentences. I may get back to later on what basis is he then arrested. But it's not on the basis of the Digital Services Act. So we are in a situation now where the conflict of laws, let me just mention something before that. So, this is one of my favorite subjects, conflict of laws, extraterritoriality, right? It's not a new subject. I mean, if you go back to the 16th, 17th century, one of the leading philosophers and legal thinkers was Hugo Grotius in the Netherlands, who developed he was really one of the first to develop international law on the high seas, right? This is what happened when no country had a territorial jurisdiction. In those days it was 3 miles, 10 miles, now it's 200 miles, whatever it is. And he really developed an international law policy on this empty space where no country had jurisdiction, the high seas. Cyberspace is that today. You cannot say which law applies to cyberspace. And in real life, the conflict of laws, which is each territory or 2 or 3 or 4 territories each say that in this particular situation, my law applies, is no longer theoretical, it's becoming a real problem. And of course, the real conflict is between US law, simply because most of these companies are based in the US, and European law. One of the cases, which is a case I know a lot myself, and now I go sort of like 10 years back, so I shall answer your question, what about the 10 years? Is the right to be forgotten. Do you know what that is? You all know what that is, right? So the right to be forgotten was something that some scholars in Oxford more or less interpreted into the directive, which was later replaced by the GDPR, saying that there is such a right that you could actually have the link on a search engine dereferenced. So when somebody enters your name and the website or the HTML URL that it refers to is hurtful, that link will be removed from the search engine, not the site as such, right? Which of course raises a very interesting question of free speech. Is it inherent in free speech that you can have your speech linked on Google? Or is it simply inherent in free speech that you can post whatever you want on the internet, even if nobody can find it? Anyway, the decision was finally, after a very important case, and that was 10 years ago, 2014, the Gonzalez case, where a Spanish individual challenged a decision not to have his name dereferenced. It had to do with the lien taken out on his property, and he had already redeemed that lien, but it was still up there. And when banks and others, entered his name, they would see that he owed I don't know how much money, and they would believe there was a case because there was no link saying that he didn't, right? So he won that case by very, very, very important judgment a year ago before the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. That led to what we have today, which is Article 17 of the GDPR, which codifies that in Europe we have such a thing as the right to be forgotten. You shouldn't confuse that with a right to rectification, which is simply something that's untrue. Right to be forgotten is something that you did, but you want it out. In my opinion, it has the quality of a human right. The European Court of Human Rights has not yet decided whether it's a human right. Let's see what happens. Anyway, that's where the real conflict started with the US. And I can say in my private practice, I still have friends, clients from the US, sending me emails saying, Dan, can you help us? And they show me the websites that have destroyed their lives completely. 2 more minutes? But I can't help them because they live in the US. The territorial scope of European law, of course, does not apply in the US. And unfortunately, that's my private opinion, it doesn't apply in cyberspace US either. There was a very important case, and I'll stop that 30 seconds, involving the data protection agency in France called the CNIL, which actually wanted to test the scope of European law in the US, right? The conflict. So they fined Google 100,000 euros for not taking down the link in an individual case, right? Google, and that was predictable, and that was a strategy, said, we will not take it down because we don't have to take it down because we're an American company and American law applies to us, not your European stuff. Again, CNIL, the data protection agency, knew that Google would say that, and it was just a test. It went up to the European Court of Justice, and they came down with a very, very important ruling in 2019, confirming that it is only in very exceptional cases that European law would actually apply in the US. Google had offered as a compromise what they call geo-blocking, right? So that anybody in Europe who would access the site of someone who had obtained that link should be taken down could not get access to it because it would geo-block, right? The Google search engine would immediately see that you were sitting in Sweden, which is part of the European Union, and therefore you couldn't see that stuff. But if you were sitting in Texas, you could. That was the compromise that Google developed, which could have worked. But the European Court of Justice actually passed over that one in silence and said that only in exceptional circumstances, but it does apply in exceptional circumstances, do we have extraterritorial application of European laws in the US. I'm really short of time. Wow, 0-0. It's been like that for 5 minutes. Why did you stop me? Okay. So a lot has been said here, and a lot more could have been said. I hope that you are better equipped now to understand what happened a couple of days ago when this guy was arrested in France. Thank you. Thank you.